James Thurston, Redefining Smart, Creating More Inclusive Cities.
So this is a picture of me and a good friend, a professional colleague, and a business partner, actually. He's also an urban planner himself. He teaches urban planning at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a disability rights advocate and leader, a global leader. He actually helped to write the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He leads a global network of disability organizations around the world, including those that have a particular focus on urban environments and accessibility. And he has a commentary, a short commentary that I think it really resonates with me. And so I often like to start with it, where I should say he's also an urban dweller. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and while his focus is urban planning, he is a technology enthusiast, like probably many, if not most of us here. And he often says that he loves smart cities, but smart cities don't love him back because he's a person with a disability. And so 3 years ago, we actually partnered with his organization, my organization, G3ICT, partnered with World Enabled, which is the organization that Dr. Victor Pineda, that's his name. Some of you may know him. We partnered to launch an initiative called Smart Cities for All, recognizing that for people with disabilities, this enormous digital transformation of cities that's happening around the world, it's happening in the global north, the global south, big cities, small cities. I'm sure it's happening across Australia as well. This digital transformation of cities, which as a technologist, I love, it's not necessarily benefiting everyone in those cities. So we partnered with World Enabled. We also partnered with Microsoft and some other partners to launch a global initiative called Smart Cities for All. And we've been doing work with cities and other partners around the world to help them think about not just being smarter, but also being more inclusive as an integral part of being smarter. And I want to talk with you a little bit about that, about how we're working with partners around the world to really redefine what it means to be a smart city. It absolutely has to mean the use of the deployment of technology, the use of data. Those are sort of the lifeblood of smart cities around the world. But we think it needs to mean more as well. And I want to talk with you a little bit about what that means to us, but maybe just briefly by way of introduction. I'm sure many of you don't know my organization, G3ICT, the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs. We are an international nonprofit organization. We were created about 13 years ago with support of the United Nations, specifically to focus on the digital inclusion of persons with disabilities and on the implementation of the technology aspects of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. A fairly broad mandate. We do that in a variety of ways, including consulting and providing advice to governments at all levels on policies and programs related to technology and inclusion of people with disabilities. We run a large annual conference in June in Washington, D.C. called the M-Enabling Summit. We also run a version of it in Europe. I would invite all of you to attend if you're able to, and to be in Washington in the June timeframe. We actually do it on the margins of the annual UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities meeting. We run the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. If you're not aware, we absolutely want you to be aware that there is an international professional society that focuses on people who have ICT accessibility as all of or part of their job. And that professional society, the IAAP, does what every professional society does. It does training and certification of professionals. I think what we know from where we are today on these issues in this community of working on technology issues for people with disabilities is, at least from my experience, and I've been working in the field for about 15 years globally. Very happily, we're not in the space of having to evangelize and convince people to care about the issue. We've sort of moved beyond that, thankfully, for a whole bunch of reasons, including the work of many of you here in this room. But where we are today is really needing to grow a profession that can help companies, cities, national governments make the kind of improvements that they want to make. And I know many of you are engaged in that work. The Professional Society was set up several years ago through a collaboration of companies, competing companies actually, but also civil society organizations and governments to really grow the profession of ICT professionals that will help implement the kinds of change that we're all working towards. So that's another piece of the work that we do. And then, like I mentioned, a few years ago, we launched Smart Cities for All, specifically to focus on cities. And I'll tell you a little bit about why we decided to have such a strong focus in one of our program areas on cities. Cities are our future. I quickly Googled this morning what part of the Australia population lives in cities. I saw 90%. You can let me know if that feels right or not, but according to the internet, 90% of Australians live in a city. About 50% of the population around the world today lives in a city. That's going to grow to 70% by 2050. So there's an enormous movement, migration of people into urban centers. In some geographies, this demographic trend is even more strong than others. In China, for example, for China to keep up with the numbers of people that are moving into cities, they would have to build a new city of 1 million people every week. There's that many people moving into cities. 10 of the 11 fastest growing cities in the world are in Africa. So we were seeing in our work around the world this trend, not necessarily alarming on its own, but taken with some other trends, we had some concerns, which is why we started to focus more on cities, smart cities, and the extent to which they are inclusive today. Another trend we are looking at is just the overall digital transformation. We know, and I know just from seeing many of you speak and meeting some of you over the past couple of days, we're undergoing a digital transformation and really in all sectors of society. And like I said, we see this in all kinds of economies, emerging economies, developed economies, big countries, small countries. Really the increasing prevalence of technology in our lives to the point where we are using technology from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, and even while we're sleeping, our Fitbit is telling us how we are sleeping. So we're seeing this digital transformation in all sectors, in education, in transportation and mobility, certainly in public safety, courts and justice systems. And again, taken on its own is actually, I think, is quite exciting, the potential for it to be really not just achieving efficiencies and cost savings, this digital transformation, but really transforming how we are interacting with each other in a positive way and with our communities. Just some of the statistics that you see here that in particular resonate with me. 70% of youth around the world are online in every country. This is a global statistic, which is we truly do have a generation of digital natives that are expecting to be using technology throughout the course of their day to support all the kinds of activities that we as human beings do throughout our day. Maybe a little bit more specific to smart cities, if you think of mobility as a service, which is using technology to do ride sharing, I don't see a lot of the dockless bikes and scooters here. Maybe they're here and I'm just not seeing them. They're everywhere in a lot of the countries and cities where we do work. That kind of mobility as a service is going to be, within the next couple of years, replacing over 2 billion car journeys every day around the world. So we're really leveraging technology more and more for our own transportation and mobility. There's a mobility as a service company called Moovit, M-O-O-V-I-T. You can get their app and use it here in Australia. They have 500 million users around the world, and they do transportation planning. So you can plan a trip across different modes of transportation, public transportation, private transportation. And so they've got 500 million users around the world, and they're supporting 5 billion trips a day through their technology. So it really is, this transformation is incredible when you think about the scope of it. We also know that cities, as part of this digital transformation, are really on the leading edge in some very exciting ways. The market for technology, for smart city technology in cities, is more than $2.5 trillion US dollars. So cities, in many ways, more so than national governments, are enormous consumers of technology. And not only are they consuming the technology, but they're really innovating around the technology and how they're deploying technology to support the broad range of services that cities provide. And another colleague of mine often says that cities is where we all live, work, and play. And increasingly, they're using technology to support all of these functions that are so important to us in cities. I actually live in the city of Washington, D.C., which I try to say with a straight face, but it's hard, is technically a smart city, but from a technology perspective. And they are doing some really innovative things around the deployment of technology, particularly in the transportation space in the city, but also in public safety, in some other areas. And we see this deployment of technology, really innovative technologies, like I said, in cities big and small, global north and global south. So by way of definition, there's probably a different definition for a smart city. There's as many as there are cities, most likely. One of the ones that we actually use that I like, in part because it's short, is a smart city uses ICTs to enhance the livability, workability, and sustainability in the city. I like this because of the focus on ICTs, but also it has an explicit human component in there, which I think is a good hook for the kind of work that we all do, the livability piece of it. That these cities, the deployment of technology, the use of data, needs to really have some human benefit. It's not just about cost savings and efficiencies. For us, when we're looking at smart cities, we probably have an opt-in kind of definition of what a smart city is. If a smart city is just using mainstream technologies, if it has a website and a mobile app and they want to call themselves a smart city, great, we love that. You don't have to be using leading edge technologies like sensors and machine learning and AI. Many cities do increasingly. But if you're deploying technology, whether it's more mainstream or leading edge, what we're concerned with is that it works for everyone, that it's accessible and promoting inclusion. So I mentioned that I'm from Washington. Probably most of us here either live in a city or near a city. And think about the range of services that cities provide to us on a day-to-day basis. Education, transportation and mobility. Cities play a role in all of these. Healthcare, public safety, policing, courts and justice systems. And increasingly what we're seeing as part of this digital transformation is that they're using technology to provide all of those services, which again, as someone from the technology industry, I love that. I think it's exciting. As someone working on human rights and disability rights and accessibility, we see some real risks there, frankly. The accessibility has to be a component of all of these technology deployments. And so when cities are using kiosks to support transportation systems, there are, as you know, there are ways to make those accessible. When they're using contactless payments, there's ways to make sure that that's accessible to people with different disabilities. I mentioned the company Move It, the transportation planning company. It's had its own accessibility journey within the company that's pretty interesting. I'd invite you to sort of Google it and look it up. But they really drove accessibility through their platform and did some things that make their platform more accessible, their mobility as a service platform more accessible. Like if you think of a transportation planning app or program, there's going to be a lot of schedules, a lot of maps. Obviously, making those accessible became important. Slimming down some of that information so that people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities don't have information overload and can use the app. And they did a lot of user testing around this. So their journey is the kind of journey that we're trying to promote with cities as they're deploying technology to support all of these services in the city. Another area that we're seeing a lot of investment in technology by cities and states is in courts and justice systems. Many courts, primarily for cost-saving reasons, are going completely paperless. I don't know if that's a trend here, but we're certainly seeing it in countries around the world and in cities around the world that also run court systems. Again, it's exciting and interesting, but that information flow in courts and justice systems is critically important to the lives and welfare of people who are participating in that, whether you're participating as a plaintiff or a defendant or in a civil suit or even as a juror or a lawyer. Making that very important information accessible needs to be a priority. And we know that in many of these deployments that we've seen around the world in court systems, they're not accessible yet. We also see cities investing in technology, deploying technology around digital payments, mobile payments, online payments, for whether it's for fines and fees or licenses or again, all as a resident of a city, I like that, but often not really thinking about accessibility as part of that. One of the key pieces of being in the more traditional definitions of a smart city is citizen engagement. How do we deploy information to our citizens, and how do we also crowdsource and get information from them? Whether it's something in the US, what we call a 311 system, where you can report a light out or a pothole or crime, whatever it is. Some really important ways of communicating back and forth with your city and supporting that with technology. Obviously, it's critically important to make sure that those are also designed and deployed in a way that's accessible to everyone in the city. Housing is another area. I was speaking with a colleague in Chicago recently. That city provides housing support to low-income people in the city. And they had gotten to the point where they were about to move to the only way that you as a low-income person could apply for housing support, and people with disabilities do make up disproportionately numbers, low-income numbers and poverty, but they were moving to completely online application for housing support. A critical service, and so it's critical that it also be accessible. And generally speaking, Chicago is actually quite good on these things, so I believe that their service was going to be accessible, but I think they're also thinking about alternative ways to apply for housing support, even beyond technology. So where are we today? If we sort of look around the world, how are we doing in terms of creating smart cities, supporting smart cities that are deploying technology, using data, and being inclusive? We've probably heard quite a bit, and I know many of you guys are working in the field. Today, the technology that's being deployed by cities around the world is not accessible enough. It's not supporting inclusion enough. One of the things that G3ICT, my organization, does is we actually do an annual survey, an analysis of every country that's signed the UN Convention. We do a survey and analysis of how well they're implementing the technology aspects of the convention and how accessible they are. So, for example, just 40% of countries that have signed the UN Convention today, I think this is 2019 data, just 40% of them have websites that are accessible. That doesn't mean that in that 40% that all of their websites are accessible, but some of them are. In just 18% of countries around the world would you find accessible websites within the top 10 media, the private sector websites. So there's some real work to be done, even in the sort of mainstream technologies like web, to make sure that we are deploying e-government services in a way that is accessible. When we started the Smart Cities for All project, we actually did a pretty extensive global study. We did roundtables around the world in smart cities, and we surveyed 250 experts around the world on smart cities and inclusion and accessibility as part of that. And what we found, unfortunately, sort of proved our thesis, which is that today, smart cities are actually making the digital divide worse, not better, for people with disabilities. So we have a lot of work to do. 60% of the experts that we surveyed said that smart cities are failing people with disabilities today. That as they're deploying technology, it's actually working, making and navigating the city, getting access to services more of a challenge than before. Importantly, just 18% of these experts knew of a smart city that were using some very robust ICT accessibility standards. This is maybe even particularly relevant here in Australia because you actually have adopted a global ICT accessibility standard, EN 301549, as an Australian national standard. So you have access to these standards and cities can be using them. But very few do today, unfortunately. And as part of our work last year, we actually created a playbook, which I'll mention in a minute, around urban innovation ecosystems. We also have found that the great accelerators and incubators that cities are working with to develop the next generation of smart solutions are also contributing to a bigger digital divide, because these startups that are creating, again, very interesting smart solutions typically don't have staff on board that know about disability and accessibility, and the solutions coming out of them are typically not accessible. So we're creating more and more solutions that are being deployed in cities that are less and less accessible. And just a third, or fully a third of the, we surveyed 175 entrepreneurs around the world in accelerators and incubators today. And a third of them were unsure whether or not their solution would work with someone with a disability. I actually think that number is much higher, but that's what this cohort of entrepreneurs said. But we can design cities, and we're working with cities around the world to create smart cities that are also inclusive. So on our website, and I won't deep dive on this too much, but we've actually created a set of tools that are available in 10 languages today, designed specifically for some of the biggest barriers that we know cities are facing as they're becoming smarter, as they're deploying technology. There's a guide to the 3 priority standards that every city CIO, every city IT department needs to know about and use. There's a guide to adopting a procurement policy, making sure that cities, which are enormous consumers of technology, that when they're putting out their tenders or RFPs, that they're specifically requiring accessibility as part of that investment in technology. There's a communications guide of how do you make the case in your city up your management chain through the IT department to the city council. How do you make the case for investing in being a more inclusive smart city, making sure that as you're investing in technology and deploying that technology, that it really does work for everyone. And importantly, this making the case goes beyond just the human rights case, which is important. It goes beyond the legal compliance case, which is also important, but also makes the business case in a technology case, frankly, that there are technical reasons that we would, as a city, want to be focusing on inclusion and accessibility. We're creating a database of solutions. Every city that we work with, the CIO will say, just tell me which smart solutions to buy, which are the most accessible. So we're actually starting to create a database of solutions. I mentioned this innovation playbook, which helps cities work better with their urban innovation ecosystem, with their accelerators and incubators. And then we also have a maturity model, which actually allows us with the city to do an assessment across 27 different variables of where it is today in terms of being an inclusive, accessible, smart city, and then lay out a roadmap for how to improve. So the way that we're thinking about and trying to really drive cities around the world that we're working with in being more accessible, being more inclusive as a smart city is built around 5 pillars that I want to just touch on briefly with you, because we found that these are kind of instrumental, first and foremost, to being a smart city. And then what we've done is sort of put an inclusion and an accessibility lens over these, that if you want to be a smart city, you need to be doing these things. If you want to be an inclusive smart city, think about these 5 pillars, these activities in a slightly different way. So for example, we work with cities around strategic intent. Does the city have a digital inclusion strategy? Is that digital inclusion strategy, is it linked to their sustainability strategy or the city's economic development strategy, to their transportation strategy? All of these need to have a focus on digital inclusion, and specifically within a digital inclusion strategy, we really work with cities to make sure that people with disabilities are an explicit part of that strategy, that it's not just sort of a broad universality kind of strategy, that there is some specific focus on people with disabilities as part of that city's attempts to become more inclusive. We really work in another area in terms of strategic intent around the business case. We think it's really important, based on the work that we've been doing with cities over the years, that they move beyond just thinking about legal compliance and risk avoidance for thinking about accessibility, which really drives you to sort of do the bare minimum. We really encourage and work with cities to start thinking about how to have a broader perspective on that there's a return on investment for having a focus on accessibility as you're deploying technology. Leadership is a key variable that we've seen, and really one of the examples that I point to there is the city of Chicago. They have a disability commissioner. Many cities in the U.S. and in Latin America in particular have disability commissioners. They're at a political level. They're appointed by the mayor, and they're a peer to the CIO and the transportation commissioner. So they can really drive change at that level, which is critically important, we think, to success in being an inclusive smart city. And then obviously budget and funding for these programs. A second set of variables that we look at is around culture. And this really comes from smart cities. Smart cities in general have a culture of innovation. They have a culture of citizen engagement, this back and forth with citizens, and a culture of transparency as well, of making information available through open data policies and portals, and really pushing out as much information about programs and policies as possible to citizens and people in the community. We think these are also critically important to being an inclusive smart city, and so as part of our work with cities, we're working with them to make sure that their innovation ecosystem is inclusive, that it is diverse, that there are people with disabilities in all roles of the accelerators and the incubators, from not just testers, but also actually entrepreneurs themselves, mentors, which are a critical part of the programming in accelerators and incubators, and even to the extent possible, providing some of the venture, or at least advice to the venture capitalists that are investing in the work within these accelerators. In citizen engagement, again, many cities, and maybe also here, are creating these systems supported by technology to have this communication back and forth. A couple examples that I talk about are Chicago just implemented a digital 311 system, incredibly broad. It is the main way of interacting with the city of Chicago, which is the third biggest city in the United States. So huge population, huge numbers of people coming in for conferences or as tourists, and they did a lot of work from the outset to make sure that system was accessible, from the design stage through the testing, actual user testing. On the flip side, I've seen, I won't mention the city, but in a leading technology center, they've created a similar citizen engagement channel, digital 311 system that is not accessible. So they've invested a lot of money and time, years, in developing this system that people with disabilities can't really access. And then they're struggling with how they're going to go back and remediate that. So those are the kinds of problems that we're really trying to avoid with cities as they're making these technology investments. Transparency and diversity are another, we think, core piece of the culture of an inclusive smart city. The diversity piece is actually, does the city think about hiring employees with disability? Because what we've seen in cities that do, and in companies that do as well, that there really is a broad benefit of actually having peers within the city who are working there with disability. Another pillar that we look at as we're working with cities and really try to drive change in cities is around the governance and process of cities, just how they run themselves in general. The organizational structure. I think one of the key success factors that I've seen in cities is if they actually have, if it's a big city, if they actually have a unit, an organizational unit focused on people with disabilities, the mayor's office of people with disabilities, and if it's a smaller city, at least a named manager, that there's a person responsible for policy and programming relevant to disability. And this is important because it's being a part of the organizational structure as opposed to sort of advisory commissions and those sorts of things. We've seen them really drive actual change in key departments that are deploying technology, like the transportation department. Procurement, I've talked a little bit about how the purchasing power of cities is enormous. They need to leverage that more to drive the industry to continue to focus on innovating around accessibility and competing on accessibility. Metrics and measurement, data drives smart cities. Every smart city has some sort of a dashboard with information about public works and about transportation, and we really encourage cities to make inclusion and accessibility a part of that dashboard and be measuring it specifically over time, including ultimately beyond process sorts of metrics to actual outcomes. Are we impacting the poverty rates of people with disabilities in the city? Are we impacting education and employment rates? I mean, which is really why we're doing this work. Obviously, technology is key to a smart city. Does the city know whether or not its technology assets are accessible? If they're not accessible and there's problems with some of the technologies they're deploying, what is their remediation process? Do they even have a remediation process? Are they using global standards? Again, here in Australia, you guys are fortunate that you've got a national standard that is a global standard for ICT accessibility. And importantly, this solutions development. One of the things that I find most exciting in cities is, at a bare minimum, focusing on accessibility of their technology deployments. But how is the city thinking about using technology to really address long-standing urban accessibility challenges? The top couple of problems that I hear from disability commissioners in cities around the world is one, their streetscapes and sidewalks are inaccessible and they have no idea how to get a handle on that. Another is indoor wayfinding. In conference centers, in airports, train stations, how do they facilitate better indoor wayfinding? And technology actually has a role to play in both of those. And we see cities doing some really cool things, frankly, with technology. New York City, for example, a big city with a lot of streets and sidewalks, is using LiDAR technology through a company called Cyclomedia to get a handle on how accessible their streets and sidewalks are. It allows them to prioritize where to put investments. They can't fix everything all at once, but with that kind of technology and data, they can start making an investment strategy to really address what is probably the biggest pain point they have, which is their inaccessible streets and sidewalks. We also look at how the city's actually attacking the digital divide. You could be deploying the most accessible technology in the world in a city, supporting your transportation systems and your healthcare systems. But if people with disabilities don't have connectivity, they don't have access to devices, and they don't have digital skills, it doesn't matter how accessible the technology is. And so that's going to be a part of the work that these cities, these inclusive smart cities, are doing as well. And we see some really innovative work going on around the world by cities on addressing those issues of digital inclusion. And then finally, data, which is a key part of any smart city. Just like there's a digital divide around the world, people with disabilities have less access to devices and connectivity, or less than the rest of the population as a whole. There's also a data divide. People with disabilities are generally data deserts or data islands. And keeping in mind that in smart cities, by a traditional definition, data is the real lifeblood driving what smart cities are doing. All of these programs in cities are data-driven. But what we know is that people with disabilities aren't generating data at the same rate that the rest of the population is, that they're underrepresented in key data sets that drive the decision-making of cities, of smart cities. The example that I often point to here is actually in Catalonia, in Spain. You may have seen in the news that for years now, there's been some thinking and activity around Catalonia, the state of Catalonia leaving Spain. And actually next week is the big annual Smart City Expo. It's always in Barcelona. A couple years ago, I walked around the floor talking to some of the vendors who create smart solutions. And there was one that's actually a Catalonian company that had created a smart solution that allows cities to get a better understanding of what the people in the city are thinking. And in Catalonia, they had done surveys of people about what they thought about leaving Spain. They had actually had elections that were gave a perspective, but they wanted a different perspective. And so this company actually had created a solution that looks at other kinds of data sets to get a sense of what people are thinking about an issue in the city, in this case, leaving Spain. And it looks at social media streams and some other kinds of data as well. Really interesting stuff, and the implications and applications are huge and interesting. But they had no idea whether or not it was accessible, whether or not it was accounting for the underrepresentation of people with disabilities as part of that. And if you're thinking about something like a policy decision that's data-driven in a city or a state, like seceding from the country, that's going to have a big impact on people with disabilities, on everyone, but certainly people with disabilities. And so making sure that their voice is represented in the data is key, really, to a smart city being an inclusive smart city. So how does the city deal with that data divide is a part of the strategy. And then just like using technology to solve these long-standing urban accessibility challenges, we can be using data, and we are using data to solve these challenges. I was doing some work with our team and some others with the city of Guadalajara, which is the second biggest city in Mexico. That the company Move It that I had mentioned to you was actually there, and they were providing real-time some incredible data about transportation flows based on the Move It's data of the hundreds of thousands of users in the city, and how they moved around the city. And it became really helpful, actually, even in an initial conversation, to the city about how they were prioritizing which bus stations and subway stations they would be making accessible first. So applying that kind of data that's available through partnerships with companies and others can be really instrumental in making sure that we're addressing some of these big urban accessibility challenges that cities around the world all face. So those are the 5 pillars, the sort of way that we're looking at smart cities from an inclusion perspective, and really trying to help these cities that are wanting to be more inclusive be smarter, but also be more inclusive as part of that journey. So I'll end sort of the same way that I end where we're doing work in countries around the world, which is really to kind of issue a challenge. That as the cities here in Australia are becoming smarter, and they are, I see the technology even in this short visit, think about and act on being both smarter and more inclusive in leveraging some of these sort of key pillars of being both. So with that, I think there may be a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. Yes, we have a few moments for questions.
Hi, I'm Ignacio. I'm Spanish. So I was really interested about the data that you collected, or actually that company collected in Catalonia. How do you make sure that the data that they got is actually correct?
So we had conversations with them. We're not partnering with them, and we don't have access to the data. I think what was concerning to me was that the developers that we were talking with, and it's we're not in the business of naming and shaming necessarily. So,
No.
But they weren't. They didn't know whether or not their solution was underrepresenting people with disabilities, or even if parts of the solutions itself were accessible or inaccessible, which is always a flag to me that if the developers can't have a conversation about disability and accessibility, then not necessarily a good sign. I'm hoping that they actually went back and did some work on that, because in general, actually, Catalonia and Barcelona do some amazing things around being accessible as part of being a smart city and a smart state.
The question is more about, because you are gathering all this data from some external parties, the thing is, how do you make sure that you actually include everyone, or the accuracy of that data that you are gathering, so that you can actually create some, solutions?
Sure. We actually did some work, to this point, did some work with the city of Chicago earlier this year. And one of the areas that they had identified that they needed to do the most work on was around data. They have an open data policy. They're pushing a lot of data out. They rely on some key data sets to make a lot of decisions. And they didn't know, how representative those data sets are. And so what they've actually started doing is that the Disability Commissioner, along with the CIO and their staffs, obviously, have actually started working with partners. Some of that data is provided by the Transportation Department. Some of it's provided by private vendors. But really put in place a process to at least do an initial evaluation of risk in terms of what's the risk of underrepresentation of people with disabilities and the implications of that. So they've started that process of the same way you'd be doing an analysis around privacy and security and other issues, but frankly, really looking at their data from an inclusion perspective.
Hi, I'm Rosalind. I wanted to ask, is there a crossover with the need for, or the drive from like government surveillance needs or government risk needs, military needs in transforming cities into the movement to make them smarter as well. So specifically, like big cities making big changes, for fear of, attacks and terrorism and stuff like that. And how much technology has, what's the overflow? Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm sorry, this is my alarm going off. Because of tell me if I'm getting this right. Because of the security concerns and other concerns, there absolutely is a lot, the deployment of a lot of technology and the use of data being generated by that technology for those purposes. Are you asking sort of, is that also being used for other purposes, or?
I'm just saying, where's the money coming from? Like, that's the biggest budgets in the whole world of every country, of every city and every nation is, military budgets, and how much that's driving tech and making cities more accessible, like how governments are, surveilling people more. And do you know any cities where that's crossed over and it's been really good for people with access, to drive accessibility? Or are there any examples where it hasn't worked?
I don't know specifically around the security space, but I do know that there are the deployments of technology, including kind of surveilling technology, that we do see cities thinking about ways to use that data in creative ways to help the city be more inclusive and deal with some of these urban innovation challenges. For example, one of the discussions that I had with the city, Chicago actually, was the fact, and I've had this conversation with some of you here this week, the garbage trucks in Chicago all have a camera on them for a variety of reasons. Garbage trucks in most cities, and the ones in Chicago, go everywhere in the city, including down alleyways, and they're constantly getting this data, and they go at least once a week, I think. So there's a lot of this data coming in. And so there were conversations between the disability organizations in the city, the Public Works Department, which runs the garbage trucks, and others in the city. Can we use that data, apply machine learning, artificial intelligence, to get a sense of, again, the biggest pain point, which is how accessible is our streetscape? This is constantly being updated data because they're on the trucks. But can we repurpose that? That's not why they're on there, but can we repurpose that data somehow in a positive way to address some of these challenges? I don't know about the security data specifically and how cities are using that to promote more inclusion, but I suppose it could be possible. Sure. Thank you very much, and congratulations to Utopia on a really fantastic conference. Thank you.